So I sometimes get to spend some time with my grandkids and now even my great grandkids. I've got 6 of them now. And whenever I spend time with them, I finish my time with them on a particular day. I come away thinking, oh my, things have really changed. And I pick them up from school and I ask them what they did that day. I've been doing that and delivering them to their home or to daycare centers where they're watched over until their parents get off work. And I just start thinking about what they are able to do and at the age that they're able to do things. And it leaves me dumbfounded. I don't think there's maybe a better word for it. It's like jaw-dropping, because what I'm doing is I'm comparing it to my time when I was their age. Now, I didn't go to kindergarten. And I realize nowadays they even have preschool before kindergarten, and then they have kindergarten, and then they have first grade and so forth. I didn't go to preschool. My preschool was on the farm, in the kitchen around the house with my mother mostly, and following her around. And she didn't always stay in the house. She had a lot to do outside, helping to take care of the dairy calves and feeding and different things when my dad was away working somewhere, or even when he was over in the fields. So that was my kindergarten and preschool, or vice versa. And my first grade was in Paris, Idaho, at a school building called the Emerson Elementary. It's no longer standing, but it was a building that contained grades 1 through 8. And it was quite an experience for me, particularly now when I look back on it, because, for example, in first grade, that's where I learned how to read. Now, a lot of kids nowadays know how to read before they even go to school, at least somewhat. I don't remember spending a lot of time learning how to read before I went to school. And when we did get to school, our reading books would be books that had you look at pictures and then say the words. And of course, the alphabet was taught, and the phonetical sounds of the letters of the alphabet were taught. And it was that phonetic approach that they took, and we'd look at the pictures and try to figure out what they said and combine our whatever they taught us to say, or to open up a book and read pages like, and it would say, run, spot, run. And it would have a spotted dog running across the field. And then it would say, you'd turn the page and it would say, run, Jane, run. And it would have a little girl whom we presumed was Jane, and she would be running across the field. And then you'd turn the page and it would have Spot and Jane, run. And you'd have to figure that out. And finally, you got used to the words and combining with the pictures. And that was it. And then kind of repeat it in different formations. And eventually, they'd add words like see Jane play. And they'd have her doing some playing. And see Spot jump. Those kinds of things. Anyway, those were our reading books. They seldom had more than sentences with 3 words, and it was just constant repetition. So that's how I learned to read. And I don't consider myself a bad reader. In fact, in lots of ways, I think I'm a good reader. But that's the way it was back when I went to school back in about 1966, or not 66, 1956. It was about the time I got to first grade, 1956, 57. There I was in first grade. My teacher was Mrs. Athy, I remember. And we were taught respect, and we were taught obedience. We were taught that, what it meant to be quiet and when we should be quiet. And we were taught manners. When we went to eat, we were told how to say thank you and please and those kinds of things. So I won't go into all the details. So I went to second grade. In second grade, my teacher was a lady by the name of Helen Crawford. And she was, I don't know. It's hard to guess ages when you're that young, but because she seemed pretty old at the time. But I don't suppose would have been much more than her early 50s. But anyway, she had kind of gray hair and was aging, and she was a really kind person. I remember I felt more like being mothered in that class than I did some other elementary classes that I had teachers in. And we would stay with that teacher all day, and we'd have, she'd excuse us to go to recess. And if we need to go to the restroom, there was a way to get her attention and tell her what we needed. And the thing that I have taken away from that second grade experience that was really unusual now that I look back on it, because I didn't do it in my other classes so much. But Mrs. Crawford in second grade would have us all stand every morning, without fail. The first thing we did after the bell rang and we were to start school was to sit in our desks, and she would have us stand, and we had a flag sticking out from one corner of the wall in the corner. And we would all stand, and in unison, we would sing the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. And that we never missed a day. It's always what we did. Then right after that, she would get the Bible out, and she would sit at her desk, and she would read several chapters, at least one or two. Sometimes she thought she had our interest a little more. She would read maybe 3 or 4, but she would read chapters from the Bible. And we didn't really talk about it much. She may have made a comment or two about what the storyline was that she was reading, because we didn't comprehend it all. I don't think, at least I didn't. I was a little slower than some, but I didn't get all of that, what all the meaning of all that Bible story stuff was, unless she explained it a little bit, which she did at times. But you can see why I think back on it now, because laws have been passed, or so they say, that prohibits all that now. And you could search the country over in the public school system, and you would never find a single school or a single classroom where the teacher would every day get the Bible out and read from the Bible. So it was an unusual experience, and I've often reflected about it and about her, how important she felt that was for us to have just a little experience with the Bible every day. I liked her. She would talk to us quite often about making sure that we didn't say something or do something that would hurt another person's feelings. she talked to us about including everybody and talking in kind ways. And she would tell us, when somebody had maybe lost a loved one or had an accident or just wasn't feeling well that day for whatever. She would tell us, how we should treat each other. And I learned a lot in second grade. There were some good experiences there. In third grade, before I leave second grade, I have to say one other thing. One of the things I remember is about Mrs. Crawford is we had what we called a May Day walk. And she, in her class, she always took people on May Day walks. And May Day walks was the first day of May every year, at least if the weather was tolerable at all. And we would all be told to pack a paper lunch, or lunch in a paper sack and bring it to school the next day along with something to drink. And we did that. She kind of built our interest up, and I can remember we all got in, not single file, but double single file. And we walked in pairs, and we left the school building early, not too long after we'd read from the Bible, said our Pledge of Allegiance. We'd file out of the classroom and get on the sidewalk, and the place where we were going is kind of on the other end of town. So we would walk along the sidewalk by twos with our little sack lunches. We didn't have backpacks much back in those days, but sometimes our parents would put them in a cloth bag or something like that on days like that, and we'd stick it under our belts, untie a loop, and we could pack them along that way if we didn't want to be encumbered with a paper sack lunch. So we would walk along by twos, and everything that we did back in those days was done kind of arbitrarily. It's not like they would say, okay, find your best buddy and you can walk by him. No, you just kind of walked out of the room by the row that you were sitting in, and we had assigned seats, and whoever lined up with you on the other side, whether it was a boy or a girl or whoever, somebody that knew you or somebody that didn't know you quite as well, and that's who we walked with, clear along the sidewalk to the end of town. Well, when we got to the end of town, we turned and started up Paris Canyon, and we'd heard that she liked to go up by her house, is where they had the lunch. And I didn't know where she lived for sure, but found out that she lived up kind of at the mouth of Paris Canyon. And so we turned and walked west up the streets and stayed on the sidewalks where there was sidewalks, but eventually got off and just walked up the road on one side. And eventually we got to where her house was. Well, we didn't go in her house, but her house, behind her house was a beautiful hillside, and it was just that time of the year. It was just getting some spring grass, and it was just beautiful and green. And I remember that when we went up there, it was a warm day, and birds were singing, and it was. We ate our lunch there and talked and visited and just laughed and had a good time, and we always kind of kept it under control, because all she'd have to do is say, okay, let's quiet down and come back or whatever. If we got started straying off, and she would bring us back, and then we'd walk back to school. Well, I remember that as part of her class. Well, the next class, third grade was also taught by a lady whose last name was Crawford. And she lived almost right next, well, I shouldn't say right next, about a block away from the school. And she looked like a very stern person. She had glasses and was kind of thin, and third grade was kind of interesting to me because some of the times they'd read us chapter books, and they would read books that when I think about them now, I'm a little more familiar with them, are just like way over somebody's head. I mean, it sounded good. Like we'd read a book like Robinson Crusoe. Well, if most people know the book Robinson Crusoe, I think it's by Daniel Defoe. Anyway, they would, but what made it interesting, it wasn't so much the reading, because the vocabulary was actually kind of difficult. But she would stop and then she would explain what had happened and try to build our anticipation up. And I'm pretty sure she could tell when we'd reached our saturation level for that particular chapter or that day or that book. And she would put it away and we'd bring it out another time and read it. The other thing and I don't know why this memory comes to me, but it was in third grade, and it was 1959, I think. They changed the back of the copper penny. And I remember her making a big deal out of that. And I think it was also 1959 when Alaska and Hawaii became the 49th and 50th states. 1959. So until then, it was just 48 stars on the flag, and then after that, there was 50. And I can remember her teaching about in history, how those states actually got their stars on the flag because we were getting 2 more that year. Well, it's interesting how you remember things. In fourth grade, my aunt was the teacher. Her name was Aunt Opal, and she taught for quite a while. And of course, she knew me. I was her nephew, and I think she expected a little more out of me than I showed. But she was kind. The only problem I had is she would get together with my mom and dad and tell them everything that happened. And I thought maybe she ought to keep some of that to herself because it got, I just had to be real careful. Let's put it that way. More careful than I wanted to be. But, I didn't dare even have a girlfriend because I was afraid that Aunt Opal would find out who it was and tell my parents. And the other thing I can remember is that there was a high school, one of the other elementary teachers had a son who was in high school who was just an excellent trumpet player. His name was Dan Rich, and he could play the trumpet like nobody's business. He was doing solos and all the programs. I remember one program or one song in particular he could play on the trumpet. It was called Cherry Pink in Apple Blossom Time. And it was just it was built for a trumpet solo. Well, come to find out, he's going to get rid of his trumpet and get a new one. And guess who got the old one by way of my Aunt Opal? My parents. She had encouraged them to get me started in music. And anyway, I got this trumpet, and it was kind of dinged up. This other guy that could play it so well had played it, and it wasn't new looking by any means. But I always felt like there was a little pressure on me to play the trumpet. And it came by way of Aunt Opal to my parents, who bought the trumpet, and I think they paid, I want to say $40, which back in those days was quite a bit of money for this used trumpet. And what really got me was they expected me to play it just like Dan Rich played it. When I put my lips to the mouthpiece, the same sort of stuff that he made happen when he put his lips to the mouthpiece, I felt like that was supposed to happen when I did it. And it was not about to be, because I couldn't, but I tried. And eventually I did get another trumpet, and I played trumpet all the way through high school and had a lot of good memories because of that. And that was all because of Aunt Opal in the 4th grade. Well, in the 5th grade, I've already told you a little bit about, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in the 5th grade, but other than to say that Mr. Howell taught there. His name was Garrett Howell, and he taught. We had a little run-in, and I told about that in one of the other videos, so I'm not going to elaborate on that. But he taught me how to do math in a way that was very meaningful for me the rest of my life. He taught me that the word of meant times. Just think of it as a times. Well, in 4th grade, we'd already learned the times tables. So in 5th grade, it was like 20% of 50 is like 0.20 times 50. So he taught me to think of the of as a times. 20% of, 20% times 50, and I could get the answer. And I don't know why I couldn't before then, but as soon as he told me that little secret, I was good at that the rest of my life, and it got better and better as I went along. So teachers do have an effect if they take the right approach. And I suppose that goes to us as parents too. You know, we're teachers, and we influence not just our kids, but other people. And the approach, the technique matters. You can spin your wheels for quite a while, and then suddenly something will click, and it's like the gears fitting together, and things start turning, and all of a sudden you get power that you didn't have before. And that's what happened to me with the of meaning times when I did my percentages. And I've used that in my life. You know, even today when I see people at the checkout stands and they're trying to think, oh, let's see, 30% of 70, what would that be? And they have to get their calculators, and I can do that in my head just by thinking that the of means times, and away you go. So might even get you a job someday if you remember that. So in the 6th grade, I'm going through these fairly quickly because I just want to give you a flavor for what happened at different grades when I was going through Emerson Elementary. I'm not going to get into high school today, but in 6th grade, we had a teacher by the name of Mrs. West. She was divorced. She was very nice looking, quite tall, and she had a reputation of being a strict disciplinarian, but a very good teacher. She could teach you things, especially in English. She could teach you how to spell words, and she made an emphasis on teaching, on learning spelling rules. You know, I before E, except after C, some of those kind of rules that don't always work, but she had all kinds of different rules that she would help us to memorize and see that there was a rhythm, a kind of a pattern in the English language, even though it was crazy sometimes. So she had a reputation as being a good teacher. She had another reputation, and that is that she was not above bringing somebody up to the front of the classroom sometime during the year or whenever was necessary, and laying them over her lap and spanking their butt right there in front of all the rest of the students. Now, try that one today and see where you get about as far as you do when you're trying to read the Bible, I guess. You don't hear that happening very often. But I can remember very well one day in class, my friend Randy, he did something. I'm not sure what it was, but then the teacher had found out about it and didn't like it. And I don't remember ever her drawing attention to what it was, but she was good to her reputation. She said, "Randy, come up here." And she went over against the wall, got out of the chair, set it right at the front of the room in front of all about 30 students. And she said, "I'm going to sit down in this chair. And when I do, I want you to lean over my lap. And I'm going to give you the spanking of your life." And we were all, of course, just riveted to the whole thing. It's like, oh, whew, I'm ever glad that's not me. And here it comes, just like everybody said it was going to. And poor Randy, who was one of my very best friends, got his butt paddled with her bare hand right there in front of the whole class. And I've thought about that several times because she wasn't that kind of a person. But I think she did that every year. I'm not so sure she didn't plan it with him in advance or reward him some way or bribe him or something, because I never heard about what he did that was wrong. But her reputation was such that it carried from one year to the next. And when next year's group got into the 6th grade, you can bet they toed the mark. And anyways, it's been kind of an interesting thing to think about, and totally out of order of anything you'd hear today. But just as regular as clockwork, there would be somebody every year that got hauled to the front of the room and spanked. It wasn't bare butt spanking, but it was a spanking on the butt. Anyway, 7th grade, they rotated teachers. Well, they did in 5th and 6th grades too, but they'd rotate teachers in the afternoon with different subjects. And we had a teacher by the name of Mr. Rich, and he had polio earlier in his life and was in a wheelchair. So he taught in a wheelchair, and that in itself was quite an inspiration to me, because you'd see him coming to school down the sidewalks on the street, and he'd cross the street in his wheelchair. It was a motorized wheelchair. And he'd come into the school and pretty much conduct himself just like all the other teachers, except he couldn't walk. And his legs, it's the first time I'd been around in somebody that hadn't used their legs, and seeing how leg muscles atrophy when they're not used. It's kind of like a lot of other muscles we use, even our brain muscles. Our intellect, sometimes if we don't use it, it atrophies. It gets smaller instead of bigger. And his leg muscles has atrophied to the point that his pants just kind of hung on what I would call flesh and bones. And I felt bad for that. He had a daughter that was my same age and in the same class, and we were always quite respectful to him, I think, in a large part because of his handicap and the fact that he had a daughter that we were all friends with, a nice daughter. And I often thought, well, his experience at home, or her experience at home, would be a lot different than my experience at home with my father, who was out and about and doing things and working. Anyway, so I thought about that. But Mr. Rich was no pushover. He had his voice his legs might have been atrophied, but his voice was not. And the upper part of his body was just fine, but he could let it be known that you ought to pay attention and listen up. And he'd give you an assignment, and he'd tell you to do something. I can remember he gave me an assignment to do a science experiment where I ended up choosing to put beans in different kinds of soil and see how they'd grow if I watered them all the same in different kinds of soil. I still remember that experiment. But the thing I really remember about him is that I had a friend in the 7th grade who was also by the last name of Rich, and they weren't close relatives. I think they probably were relatives, but not close relatives. And he was a city kid. I was a country kid. So let me say that up front. But he got to teasing this one girl in class. Her name was Cheryl. And he got to teasing her and found out that he said some words that would just really embarrass her and make her blush, and she'd get mad and go storming off every time he said it. And one day I came to school and he said, "Here, just say this word to her and see what she does." I didn't even know what the word meant. And I'm not going to say it now, because now I do know what it means. But I said the word, and oh, yeah, she got really mad. And we thought that was kind of interesting, kind of like you're teasing the cat, and the cat gets mad, and you keep teasing it. Well, this wasn't a cat. This was a girl, but I think she could claw like a cat if you gave her a chance. She didn't claw, however, but she got mad. The more we teased her, the madder she got. And pretty soon, she'd gone to Mr. Rich, who was the wheelchair individual I was talking about. And he came to school one morning after we'd had a particularly, how do I want to say it? It's embarrassing now, but we had made this girl really irate with some of the things we said in our teasing. And shame on me now. You'd like to know the details, but I'm not going to tell you. And he said, me and this friend that were doing the teasing, he said, he called us out right after he got the rest of them settled down into some assignment. In the morning, he said, "You two come down to the office with me right now." And we went down to the office, and we weren't sure even for sure what we were going there for. But it didn't take us long after we got to the office to find out that this girl had gone home and reported us to her parents, and her parents had called the principal, and the principal had called the teacher and said, "You take care of those two right now." Now you're really curious what I did, aren't you? I'm still not going to tell you. Anyway, it's just a word that we said, but it's not the kind of word that you should use around girls in a teasing manner. And he said, "Okay," and we admitted that we'd done it. Once we had done that, he's still in his wheelchair, and I think, okay. He says, "Well, you're both going to get paddled over it, but now by paddle, I mean paddle. Like there was one hanging on the wall, an inch board on a nail, and it had a handle on it and a big, I don't know how long, it was just like 12 inches by 14 inches or something like that, and had this big handle on the back of it." And he told my friend, he said, "You guys are going to get paddled." And at first we said, "You can't get up and paddle us." That's what we were thinking. Because you're in a wheelchair. It's not going to hurt at all if you're in a wheelchair and try to paddle us. And he had that all figured out, because he told my friend, he said, "Okay, get the paddle off the wall." And he told me, he says, "Reach over and hold your ankles." Yeah, you're right. I was starting to get the picture of how all this was going to happen, and I was obedient. I thought, well, okay, I'll just take my medicine. And I reached over and held my ankles, and he handed that paddle to my friend, and he said, "Okay, this is how I want you to hit him, and I want you to hit him in the backside while he's holding his ankles, and I want you to hit him just as hard as you can with this paddle." And whoo, when he hit me, it knocked me for several steps forward. It hurt so bad, it just stung. And guess what it did to the paddle? He hit me so hard that it broke the handle off of the paddle. So, so you can imagine the rest of the story. The rest of the story is now it was my turn to do the paddling, right? And my friend bent over and held his ankles. And he said, okay, you take that same paddle and you hit him just as hard as you can. Well, what I had now was a 12 by 14-inch board. And the only way I could hold it was like put my thumbs and fingers together and hold it that way. And try to paddle him just as hard as I could, and I could hardly get any leverage there at all to make it hurt, because believe me, I would have after one way he hit me. But anyway, you're probably wondering why I'm laughing about all this, because it was quite an experience. And you're probably wondering, well, I don't think I'd have taken it with a laugh. And I didn't take it with a laugh because I was pretty sobered up by the whole thing, but I've laughed a lot about it since because of the difference in the swing. The other thing I'm kind of proud of is my parents really never even knew about that. I didn't tell them. My friend didn't tell them. As far as I know, they still don't know about it. And I got quite a blow. Well, that's 7th grade, or at least part of 7th grade. 8th grade, you'll never guess, I got paddled again. This time it was by the principal of the school who was over the 8th grade, and it was because this same darn friend that got me into trouble before, this city kids, they get you into trouble, those farm kids. And we had been flipping coins and trying to match heads and tails, and then if you lost, you had to give your coin to the other person. And he and I were kind of doing that around class, and pretty soon we'd get to where we'd go home with pretty good money, depending on what we were flipping. If we were flipping quarters or whatever, it's just a kid's way of gambling, I guess. Only it wasn't a slot machine, and we lost too on certain days, but. Anyway, the word got out, and again, back to the parents and into the principal again. And those darn kids at school are gambling and teaching our kids and taking their money and this, that, and the other. And we were hauled into the office. First of all, he scolded the whole class, I guess, thinking that maybe we weren't the only ones that were perpetrating it. And we weren't. But because we taught some others how to go about it. But he scolded us all, and he said, if I ever see you doing that again, you're going down to the office, and that paddle on the wall is going to get used again, or used on you. In my case, again, because I had it in 7th grade. But anyway, so just to show you how an 8th grader thinks, this principal was coming down the hall. We saw him coming. It was right after lunch hour when the noon bell had rung to come back to class. And we said, he's coming. Let's just fake it like we're throwing these. He can't get us if we're just faking it. And we'll see if he's on we're just going to tease him a little bit. So just as he came in the door, we went like that on our hand, like we'd flipped a coin, and we're going to match it. And he rounded the corner of the door just in time to see us do that. Well, he didn't even ask if it was real or not. He said, you two get to the office right now. Well, I'll just make it quick. We got paddled again, both of us, by the principal. So I was really pretty innocent, but I got the paddle a couple of times. My parents never found out about that one either. I didn't dare tell them because I might get it again when I get home. But back in those days, they didn't hesitate to do a little tuning up, should we say, if they needed to. Times have changed. That was old school. What we have now is new school, where none of that happens, thankfully. Whenever I tell those stories to my grandkids, they say, oh, that would never be able to, if they did that today, there would be all kinds of problems. We'd do this and we'd do that. Well, I didn't do anything. I just shut up and hope nobody found out. But, and I'll just mention one other thing that we did before I leave my elementary school experience. Mrs. West, that I've already talked about, would teach us dancing. And we would have line dances where sometimes it would be two different grades, usually 7th and 8th grade. But sometimes 6th grade would get in on it too. And we'd go in the gym and we'd march in different directions. And whoever you lined up with when the music stopped, that's would be your partner. And she'd teach you how to do these line dances and do-si-dos. And there was wording in the music that, anyway, it was actually quite fun. And we learned to swing our honey and all that. And we did square dancing too. And that was my first introduction to square dancing. It's a lot of fun. I don't know why they don't teach that today instead of some of the things they do. Because you'd have different partners and you'd actually work up quite a sweat trying to do everything they ask you to do in a square dance. And, some people went on, did that in their adult lives and joined groups. I didn't, but I've often thought it would have been fun. Maybe if my wife would have been interested and we did something like that. Anyway, so we were taught square dancing. I thought I'd add that in there too. Well, the only reason I mention these elementary school days is because it was different in those days. We actually graduated from 8th grade. We had an 8th grade graduation. And I think it was just a carryover from earlier days when a lot of students, like my mom and my dad and others of that age, decided not to go to high school. And 8th grade graduation was the end of it, much the way high school is the end of it for a lot of people now that choose not to go to college or trade schools. So I was involved in 8th grade graduation. Now, it didn't mean much because I knew I was going to go over and go to 4 more years of school at the high school, but just interesting that we were still kind of a remnant of those days when there was a milestone and it was 8th grade. Teachers are wonderful, and we judge them way too harshly, even the ones that are harsh. We shouldn't judge because it's a tough business, and I'm sure it wears on their nerves, and they feel the pressure, and I hope they feel some of the enjoyment out of it, even though I supposedly was a troublemaker sometimes. Obviously I was, but I was actually a pretty cooperative kid. When my parents would go to parent-teachers conference, the teachers would always say, "He's such a quiet boy. Doesn't say much. He's quite reserved." And when I tell my friends that on the bus, they just laugh. So I'm not sure what to believe or where I fit in, but I fit in, and they were good times, and I remember them. And I hope that you value your educations. Education takes you places. The more you gain knowledge, the more power you have, I've found out. And I can't go into all the details about how that power manifests itself as you go through life. But it's not just through employment, though that's a big part of it. The amount of earnings that you can make and so forth changes with your knowledge and your work ethic, and all those things play a part. But it pays to take it seriously. So my advice to you, whoever's watching this, if there's anybody at all still interested, you should be interested tonight because I got my butt paddled twice. That should have woke you right up. But if you're still interested, take your education seriously, especially early in life when you're not encumbered with a lot of other things like family responsibilities and insurance and electrical bills and gasoline and all those kinds of things that you have to assume when you're older. Youth is good, and it's good that the old saying is, if it's so good, how come they waste it on the young? So let that one sink. It comes out in a movie called It's a Wonderful Life. watch the movie when they're throwing rocks at the old house, and the guy in the house says, "Why do they have to always waste youth on the young?" That's a classic line. So I'll end with that, and a little encouragement that you should make the best of it. You'll enjoy it. Look back on it with fondness, even if you get a spanking or two along the way. And by the way, let's keep all this to ourselves, okay? We don't have to tell the whole world about Grandpa's youth and his butt spankings. All right. Love you. Carry on. Read on. Study on. But stay out of trouble. Bye.